Do you sometimes wonder how you could truly have an impact when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? How do you know you are moving in the right direction when it comes to becoming a more inclusive individual? As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod brings topics such as ethnicity, genders, sexuality, or religion on the table. We talk about research and science, but also emotions, feelings, and vulnerability. We discuss allyship, advocacy, and privilege. But most importantly, we talk action. Because without action, we stay still. And when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, stillness is never the answer. Welcome to As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod.
In this episode, I have the great pleasure to welcome the wonderfully versatile Régine Romain. Régine is a Haitian-American artist, educator, visual anthropologist, and equity coach living in Brooklyn, New York. She has more than 20 years of teaching, training, and supporting diverse communities on issues of race, culture, and representation through participatory and reflective learning practices. As a storyteller and cultural producer, she uses photographs, film, performance as mixed media tools to ignite critical consciousness and radical change. Régine is the founder and director of the Wawa Diaspora Center and the author of Nou Pap Bliye, a Haitian Coloring Book. She is also the director and producer of the award-winning short film and podcast Brooklyn to Benin, a Vodou pilgrimage, and Vodou Roots, a love story musical. Régine received her Bachelor of Science in International Studies from Bowie State University and her Masters of Art in Photography and Urban Culture from Goldsmiths, University of London. Let's give Régine a very warm welcome for this episode of As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod. Welcome to As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod. Today I have an amazing guest, Régine. And let's just jump in. Régine, let's start with who you are. What's your story?
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to join in your wonderful new podcast. So my name is Régine Romain, and I am the daughter of Haitian immigrants to the United States. I was born in Washington, D.C., and I live in Brooklyn. I've lived in Brooklyn for over 20 years now, Brooklyn, New York. And I am an artist, a visual artist, photographer, filmmaker. I am an educator. I've been working in New York City public schools and charter schools for over 20 years. And I'm a visual anthropologist. And so all of that together helps to create a big part of my story, which is basically, I see myself as a storyteller. I see myself holding a tradition that is known in Haiti as the Samba. And the Samba is a person who holds a knowledge of history, of culture, and shares it through song, dance, through creative means. And so that's very much who I am.
Amazing. This is a beautiful story to start with. One of the topics we talked a lot about and exchanged a lot about, you and I, is around the education. I want to start a little bit with that. And I think the first thing I would like to ask you, because I think it's not always very clear for people. There is so much information out there. But we talk a lot about critical race theory at the moment. This is obviously a topic that is on the table, in people's minds, in the news. How do you define critical race theory in the context of education?
Well, critical race theory is really a framework that exists within academia, right? So it started about 40 something years ago. And the intention of critical race theory was to be able to delve into how race, specifically how racism, has affected politics, culture, laws, how it has affected the construct of American society as we know it. And so there are tons and tons of writers, right, of historians that understand the relevance of critical race theory. The challenge that so many have is that critical race theory has been promulgated as what's happening in our public schools with our children. And that is not the case. That is not the case. Unfortunately, there is this misconception, there's this whole range of fears that so many people have that critical race theory is being taught to kindergartens, that it's being taught to their, students that are in middle school. And that's not actually the case. I think I shared with you this wonderful article, Mother Jones. The title of the article is Today It's Critical Race Theory. 200 years ago, it was abolitionist literature by Anthony Conright. I think I sent that to you. And yes, in the article, there's this photograph of a person holding a sign. And so CRT, and what they have on that sign is it says, creating racial tension, right? And so many are afraid of critical race theory because they feel that that is in essence what it is doing. But in essence, critical race theory, to be quite honest with you, I don't really see it as a theory at all. I think what it comes down to is that it is at the core of American history. It is at the core of how America was founded, and that it really is not a theory. It is in essence the way that many people have had to live their life. The accounting for how there have been laws that have discriminated, that there have been laws that have allowed white privilege or individuals that appear to be white to have continued privilege and others to be discriminated against, right? And so for many, that acknowledgement, that place in which folks are able to speak their truth have caused many discomfort. And so with that, instead of recognizing that there is a reckoning, right? Last year, 2020 was a year in which so much happened around the world. Not only did we have a pandemic, but then we had continued racial heightened violence in the United States. And so with that, we had greater protests. We had tremendous numbers of people of all ages going out and protesting inequities. And with that, there was an increased interest in many folks in reading and learning, right? And so the buzzword that came out of 2020 was systemic racism. Everyone all of a sudden knew what it meant, right? And so people were trying to acknowledge and trying to find a way to reconcile the America that they knew with the America that others are living.
Very true. So I'd like to take it back maybe like one level up. We talk a lot about critical race theory in conjunction with the United States. But actually, when we really look into what you were saying, that acknowledgement and listening to the stories of people and what they've lived through that systemic racism, I think there's a very strong correlation that we can find, not just in America, but as well in Europe. And I think it would be very interesting to talk maybe a little bit more about it because of listeners being all around the world. And more about how talking about whatever we call it, whether we call it critical race theory or whatever it is behind, and the word is not necessarily used in the same way elsewhere or outside of the United States. How is discussing about this topic so important for the work we do when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Well, the thing is that critical race theory is a buzzword right now, right? So let's just be clear that within itself, I don't know how much that's being really discussed in Europe. Specifically, it may be discussed in relation to what's happening in America, but what I think is happening around the world is a greater awareness that there are systemic inequities, right? And inequity is not the same as inequality. Inequality is recognizing that there is a place in which one group may have something over another, right? And so now everybody gets the same thing. That's equality. So if we're looking at an educational system, if there was a time where refugees in a particular community in Europe were often discriminated against, and they felt that they were not really offered all of the same benefits, and they're like, well, look, we're giving you this, we're giving you that, you have the same thing as everybody else. What equity is speaking to is that it is not about getting the same thing, it is about getting what it is that we each need. And so, for instance, if we all had the same bike, right? So there's one person who's disabled, there's one person that's very, very petite, another person who's like 6'5", and then another person who's kind of an average height, average build. Everybody gets the same bike. Everybody gets the same bike, so that's equality. But everybody doesn't get to ride.
True.
Right? And that's in essence what we're looking at. We're looking at systems across the world where there's one group that continues to benefit, but even though, quote unquote, everything's giving to everybody else, that other people are still not acknowledged, right? So the needs of folks who are part of the communities that may be disabled in some way, they may have a hearing, sight disability, they may have other issues. We can't give them the same thing, that's known, but they had to fight for their rights across the world. And there's some places still where people who are in wheelchairs literally can't move from one place to the other because the metro system doesn't accommodate them. So unless they go to the station that has a place in which they can move, then they're stuck. They're stuck in traveling in some other way, right? That's just an example. So the movement that's happening is for greater awareness of inequities, greater awareness of systems that continue to benefit one group over another.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So going back a little bit to maybe something that is a bit closer to home for you as an educator, what are the challenges that are faced by educators currently in America when it comes to critical race theory and to discussing some of these topics and I would say creating that awareness that we just talked about?
Well, for me as an educator, it's not, I don't have any issue with critical race theory because it's something that really is one that its platform or its framework is within higher education. It is within college and universities where this theory is often discussed, whether it's in social sciences or political science. So as an educator, it doesn't really have a place as a concern for me. The challenge is that there are many parents who have taken on this concern because unfortunately it has been promulgated as what's happening. So in that Mother Jones article, I just want to read this quote so that we understand the reason why this has been conflated the way that it is. So Anthony Conright says that from 2012 to 2019, critical race theory was mentioned on Fox News only 4 times. From June 2020 to May 2021, it was mentioned in 150 broadcasts. By July, it was 250 times a week. Christopher Rufo, a Manhattan Institute fellow who started banging out the CRT drum on the network, was quite frank about how and why he'd engineered the upward trend. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans. This is what he tweeted in March. That's the end of the quote. So now if we understand that this is actually a constructed trend, this is actually a constructed trend to go against the shift that's happening in our schools, which is to be much more culturally responsive, to be historically responsive, to recognize the place in which how we are teaching, what we are teaching, The way in which we are teaching does not benefit all students. To have greater equity within our school, within our hiring practices, in the way in which families are included but have been historically excluded, right? Recognizing the needs of families that speak multiple languages to have them included and to have translations or translators available. So it's recognizing that the predominance of our educational system is catered and has been catered to white Americans. Mm-hmm. But America is not only white Americans. Mm-hmm. So how do we include the narrative of the indigenous people, right? How do we recognize the fact that we are on the land, on occupied lands? Right? Mm-hmm. So one of the ways is to begin to have land acknowledgements, to recognize that when we begin our session that we can say, for instance, I am on Munse Lenape land here in Brooklyn. This is land that is still an occupied land because the indigenous people have never given up their land. Mm-hmm. So if we looked historically, we would see that there are still treaties that are still not being enforced, right? Or not being honored. That recognition as an educator is significant because how am I able to support my indigenous Native American students in the classroom? How do we support them when we continue the narrative that Christopher Columbus, founded America? Did he really? Mm-hmm. Did he really? Weren't there people here before? Historically responsive education is seeking to dismantle the way in which we have been taught, which is very white-centered, very Europe-centered.
It's very true. I don't think you mentioned it in your intro actually, but you're also a coach. This is yes. How we got to know each other. Absolutely. So I think the next question is a very coaching question, one that we use quite often. But if we could do anything, if you had a magic wand, and you could do anything, what would be the right way, in your opinion, to educate students to be more critically conscious and equity-minded? And you mentioned about kind of culturally and historically responsive as well.
Well, to be quite honest, the students are not really the challenge. It is really those of us who are the adults. A big challenge that we have is to deconstruct how we ourselves were educated. I remember in a previous conversation, we were talking about IET possibly. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure. We've talked about quite a bit, but there were many things that you mentioned to me that you were not raised in your school rearing to understand. Yep. Right. So part of that was in relation to historical events like the Louisiana Purchase that took place in 1803 between France and the United States. You were taught that it happened and it was done, but you were never taught the context in which it would happen. You were never taught that the Louisiana Purchase was a direct result of the Haitian Revolution. That what is now a third of the United States only happened because Black people, African people fought for their freedom, and the French, having fought 14 years against a group of folks who they never thought could defeat them, right? Mm-hmm. The Louisiana Purchase was a part of that acknowledgement of defeat, because France was going bankrupt fighting these Africans on the island of Haiti. And so you never received that context. So for you as a student, was it your fault that you did not get that information? It wasn't your fault as a student. It was that was on the role of the educator. That was on your school system. That was in the publications that you were reading. But now as an adult, the onus is upon you. Mm-hmm. And for those of us that are educators, that we understand that there are multiple stories in one story. There's an African proverb that says that until the lion, right, tells its own story, the tale will always glorify the hunter. Mm-hmm. Right? So until we diversify our storytelling, until we allow other narratives that have been marginalized and disenfranchised to have their rightful place in in our educational system, then we will continue to teach in a very biased way.
Mm-hmm. Very true. It's interesting how you're bringing it up here, because the next question I have actually is very much related to me as a parent. So I have two young girls. They're in an environment as well where probably some of these things are not being taught to them, because being based in Romania, this is probably not a direct impact on the Romanian history, which makes sense. However, what I don't believe is, I don't believe that educators are fully responsible for educating my children. I think I have a huge responsibility as a parent.
Absolutely, yes.
So you started answering a little bit the question, but if we go a little bit deeper, how can I, as a parent, support educators and teachers in this process and in this journey?
Absolutely. So one of the things to consider, right, is that all of us in some capacity, right, have privilege. Mm-hmm. So now that you are living in Romania and you are not indigenous to Romania, but you have particular privilege, you may have a particular passport, you may be able to move around in different ways. Part of what's important to consider is that there are disenfranchised communities in Romania, right?
Completely.
Many of them are part of what is called the Gypsy community. Is that mm-hmm. right?
Completely, yeah. Yeah,
right. And so if your daughters are being reared there and they're being reared in a household where they have a lot of privilege, how are you as their parent acknowledging the space in which there are others that may not be as privileged, not so much in the sense of pitying them, but offering your children a place in which to learn their stories?
Yes.
Part of that is, what books are you reading to your students? I mean, to your children, right? What are the books? One of the things that I did as a parent, my daughter now is, almost 30 years old, is that I got all different types of books. And it didn't mean I had to purchase them. Like, we were avid library patrons. Right. Mm. And so what I mentioned earlier about the onus being on the school system, you're absolutely right, because it's a shared responsibility. It is a shared responsibility with the parents and the school. And so now, when your daughter comes, when your children come home from school with books, what are these books? Are these books continue to perpetuate a particular story or narrative about Romania? Or is there diversity in the story? Is there diversity in the representation? Part of the work that we do as educators that are concerned about culturally responsive is to evaluate the library, is to really kind of dig into these old stories. And if these old stories continue to perpetuate bias, then are those the ones that we want our children to read? Are those the ones that we want them to hold those stories within them, within their body, within their upbringing, and that's what they think to be true?
I think it's very interesting what you're saying, because personally I'm in a slightly different situations, because indeed we have a number of cultures behind who I am and who my wife is, not being from the same nationality as well. But it's true that we still possibly look at the books that we're reading based on who am I as a French individual and what I was reading when maybe I was younger, or what she was reading. And it's true that we don't always think about how can we take it to that next level and look a little bit in a more inclusive way. That's the word there at the end of the day. Finding some of these books that are more inclusive. And it's so easy as well these days, where we have so much access to a lot more information, where indeed, as you said, when before it was you had to go to the library and look for that book and be aware of it. Now you can just go online and search what are the books that actually will give me a vision that is a bit more, I want to say, balanced in terms of more variety. So that's definitely a very, very good trick, I think, for parents who are listening, and how they want to help their children to become more inclusive and what they can do. So thank you.
Part of it is that it's not just about this, the challenge part as parents is it's not just about what is our children, what are they reading? It's what are we saying in our home? So we could have all of the great books that are all inclusive. We could have all of the language, but in our home, the biases that we have, that's what we need to begin to interrogate. So for instance, when a new neighbor moves in and that neighbor doesn't look like you, what do your children hear? Are you now afraid that the neighborhood has gone down? Do we now need to move, right? Are we afraid when we think about crime, when we think about certain things that are happening? Do we understand that there are many, many aspects to it, and what we're hearing on the news may not be exactly what is true? How are we accountable to what we are saying and what our own beliefs are? So it begins first with an acknowledgement between yourself and your wife, the biases that you may have. And because they're shared biases, you may not feel like it's a problem. It's not a problem until your daughter comes home with a friend that maybe is from another country, until your daughter may want to date someone that you feel is not, wouldn't be a good person for her. But then, is it tied to race? Is it tied to this? And so all of this begins to unravel because part of it is at the core, what are our values? What are the values that we hold, and what are the ones that we hold dear, and what are the ones that we actually are teaching our children? Not the thing, they say, do as I say, not as I do, but our children always do as we do. No matter how much we tell our children not to curse, if they hear you cursing, it's gonna come out. And sometimes they're like 2 years old and you're like,
oh, I've had that experience, definitely.
Exactly. We all have as parents. And then we're like, oh, well, nobody heard it. And then you're like, don't say that, right? That's one of the things that we first say is don't say that. But then it's like, well, where did they learn it? Mom, dad, auntie, grandma, grandpa, grandpa, grandmère, from the family, right? Or if we're not accountable to what's on the television or what's on the radio, then that's also, so it's requiring a higher level of vigilance. Which is, parenting is already difficult. And then you have to have this other element about who you are and are you upholding your own values with your family, And
it's a very interesting point you're making because, and maybe it comes from my kind of slightly like a non-judgment, I was going to say upbringing, but this is not the word, but more what I learned as I became a coach, actually, in that self-reflection that I did. But I know that now what I do is whenever I receive an article, that especially those that have a quite strong opinion behind it, is one of the first things I do is, if it's a kind of very leftist article, I would go and say, is there someone who is a bit more in the center that wrote something about the topic? Is there someone who is on the complete opposite that wrote something? And I read everything and I make up my mind slowly. I might not have all the information yet, but already I'm thinking, well, I agree with some bits of this, some bits of that. Now I can have the discussion. I can question myself rather than saying, yeah, actually, I agree with these, but I forgot to look into the other side of the coin, which might also bring me elements that I was unaware of.
Absolutely.
And I think it's a very good practice to have. And as you said, kind of questioning yourself all the time. Not always easy because we don't always recognize it, but just asking ourselves that question, is there another story to what I'm listening to or hearing or saying?
Absolutely. So, as an example, communication with you and your partner, before you came to a decision that you would have children and you would like raise another being together, there's a place in which there had to be an understanding, right? There had to be accountability. The challenge that we're having is that we have in the United States, communities that do not want to be accountable to the continued inequities. Right? So if you have a community that most of the population at the school is Black or brown children, that means children that have descended from African heritage, whether Black American or immigrant, and that means students that are Latino, Asian, depending on where you are. There are plenty of schools that have very, very small numbers of whites, and then you might have other schools that may be more, like maybe there's just 4 or 5% diversity in the sense of the student population, racial diversity, right? But regardless of either situation, how are we supporting their thinking and their development if we ourselves are not offering them other perspectives? You said that you would read an article and then read another. Here's a challenge that's happening here. Many people don't read. So there is no place in which there is a place in which there's analytical, critical thought, right? There is not that critical analysis that's happening because people are not reading on a fundamental level. You're taking what you hear on the media as true. And we know that's a dangerous place to be. It's dangerous to just take that and not to be able to have your own means to reason for yourself. If every news source that you go to says exactly the same thing, and if every news source that you go to helps you to feel that someone else is stealing from you, then it's difficult to come out of it because you're living a very biased life, and it's very difficult to see that there are other perspectives.
Completely. And it's interesting because here we're kind of closing the loop a little bit. We started with critical race theory, but actually what we're talking about here is critical theory with or without the race, or I mean there is gender, there is many other things, but that's what it is about. It's about being critical on what we are hearing, what we're listening, what we believe, and that doesn't necessarily mean we always change our mind, our opinion. We might be in the right place and happy with that, and it's in line with our values. You mentioned about the values, but we've made that conscious effort to question ourselves.
Yes. And there's discomfort. There is discomfort. There's a quote. I watched something. I just want to share this quote with you. There's an organization in Connecticut called Recenter. And so some of the students that were connected to Recenter, it created this short video, and the video is called Quarantine, right? So teens at the end, like TEN, right? Kind of like a play on word. But this one student at the end, she said this quote that just really resonated with me. It says this. She said this to everyone: get educated, have uncomfortable conversations, get comfortable being uncomfortable, because it's the only way that things are going to change. And that, in essence, what it is, what we're looking at is a fear. There is a fear that's happening the same way that, we may have had a fear, about, tons of things. There's a fear now in relation to our educational system. There's a fear now that's being promulgated as CRT. But in essence, what it is that folks don't want to be uncomfortable. In the workshops that I've done as a coach, the work that I've done in supporting educators to come outside of their own frame of reference and to move forward, there was tremendous work that was being done in the school system. And I have to tell you, there was a tremendous shift that happened in 2020. Some of the educators that were making tremendous strides in understanding other perspectives and seeing the needs, all of a sudden, because of where they were in their family, right? So for instance, what happened in 2020 around George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and many other African Americans that were assaulted and traumatized, and many unfortunately killed by the police in the United States, that for them, because their family may have police members of their family that are police officers, there's an immediate alignment with their family, which all of a sudden just shut them off being able to acknowledge that there were injustices. Right? So there's this place where it's like, where am I? So if I'm being wholly honest and authentic, this is my brother, I believe my brother. This is my husband, I believe my husband. But then over here, we have community members, which I'm not a part of. I'm not a part of this community. So the merit that community, it doesn't hold as much merit for me. I don't really believe them when they say they're being attacked. I really don't care. That's the other part too. I really just don't care. And so what we have is a lack of caring for others.
Mm-hmm.
So though the United States says that it is a Christian state, it is a Christian state with ethos that they've created for themselves, because it's not really upholding. I mean, come on, there were Christians who were, slave holders, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a place in which this duality of personality exists. So I can say that I am this good person, wonderful person, but then I don't have to acknowledge these injustices because it's not my responsibility. I didn't do it. It's not my fault. Those people always have those issues. And so there's this place where there's this disconnect that has become much more exacerbated.
It's interesting how you're putting it, because every time I think about these topics, it brings me back to, and it's very, very different, obviously, in terms of impact, but it brings me back to a few years ago. I'm sure you've seen on the news, but Notre Dame burned down. And then just after that, many people from all around the world, especially people with a lot of money, put a lot of funds into kind of repairing the cathedral and investing into it. And one thing that marked me is someone on Facebook posted a picture of a turtle in, he was probably towards, in the Pacific Ocean, going, we have animals that are being endangered, but then you have these very rich people who are putting money into a cathedral. And for me, that was exactly that. It's like what you talked about is the connection. I think to be able to make people realize how important things are and why they should be doing something, we need to also in the background create that connection with them, which is always very hard because it's very different from one person to another. The connection I have to racial unrest in America will be very different to the person who is, to my neighbor probably, who is Romanian and maybe hasn't had the chance to travel as much as I did, and so on. Creating that connection is very important. The image with Notre Dame is, we've all seen Notre Dame in movies. A lot of us have traveled there, seen it from our own eyes, with the girlfriend and the boyfriend and whoever is very romantic and so on. How many of us have seen a turtle being endangered? Very, very few of us. We don't have that connection. And I think there the image is, for me, is about saying, when we talk about these things, is how do we also create that connection to make people realize how important it is, not just for that other community that they're not part of, but also for themselves. And how do we bring them back into that conversation, into that story? As you said, it might be very uncomfortable at times, but in the long term, I think that's where we can see as well the results and how important it is for me as an individual and linking to my values and whatever is behind my beliefs and so on.
Absolutely. I mean, with that same example of Notre Dame, the amount of money that was, that I think was donated like immediately, right? It spoke volumes, not only when we think about endangered species, when we think about endangered humans, that those resources were also not available in that same capacity to other people who are in need. So in France alone, you have communities that are in need, but yet the response, because maybe where they're from, maybe, whatever, what their situations are, their race, their place in society, that support is not immediately available to them in that same way. The amount of money that was raised, I think it was like, I don't even remember, but it was quite a bit of millions of dollars that was like immediately in less than like 48 hours, right? Yep. And so there's a place in which this building had greater resonance in the sense of the image of what France is, and this is an iconic, like that is greater for some than human life. There are some that will always give in support of endangered species, but will walk past homeless people every day. right? And so that's something to consider, that we look at homeless, how we're looking at the homeless, how we're looking at people that we don't know their stories, but yet we'll do whatever it is necessary to make sure that the kitten that we see is fed and cared for. But we have a disconnect with our human brothers and sisters, right? And so that's the work. The work is that part right there, is why are we so disconnected from each other?
That's, I'm very happy actually somehow we moved into that topic, because I think we can do a beautiful link with some of the other work you're doing. You mentioned a little bit earlier on about how you use so many beautiful words, storyteller, and how did you say, you said visual, that's it, I forgot the,
oh yes, visual anthropologist, yes,
visual anthropologist, and so on. And I know you've spent a lot of time actually creating that connection between Africa and the US, between Haiti as well and America. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that part of your story actually, and how does it all fit with this bigger puzzle and who you are?
Sure. So a big part of delving into this work, delving into the work of education, is because I, as a daughter of Haitian immigrants, my first language was Creole, the second was French, and the third was English. So there's a place in which I did not myself feel included. When I started kindergarten, I was very, very uncomfortable. I was afraid to speak because I didn't know, I didn't think I could say the words right. And so I understood a lot, but I didn't speak. But later in life, I made up for it. As you can see, you can't stop me talking, right? So, so I made up for it later. But from that space of kind of being in the background and observing a lot, which is, I think, part of my interest in anthropology, is that there's a place in which I know that I didn't necessarily feel seen or heard in a particular way. And then it allowed me to also to have connections with others who maybe did not. And as I got older, I recognized there are aspects of myself, of my own identity, that were not welcome. And so a big part of the work that I do is around issues of anti-Blackness within the Black community that have been unfortunately reinforced, right? Over time, but then anti-Blackness in policies and education and in cultural settings. So I travel the world. I am very much a nomad. I have been traveling, as a daughter of immigrants, to my parents' home country, which is now also part of my identity as Haitian-American, but then in traveling to other places in the Caribbean, traveling to places on the continent, Europe. And there are a couple of continents I haven't made it to. So I haven't made it to Asia yet, haven't made it to Australia. I'm not really aiming for Antarctica. No. but all of that is really around my interest is really to promote a way of being and seeing the world. And so in the way that I see Black and brown people is that many of our stories haven't been told. Many of the stories are told by others, right? So that's also a challenge when there are folks who are available to speak their truth, but someone else has to come in and say, well, I'm the historian, I'm the one that's knowledgeable, and so I'm going to tell your story, right? There's also situations where, cultural, the issues of cultural property, right? Where foreigners can kind of come in and take a cultural art form and then go someplace else and say that it was theirs. And so there's so many places in which folks who often have been marginalized and kind of pushed aside need to come forward. And so this is a time of reckoning. This is a time of shifting. As the daughter of Haitian revolutionaries, my family's name is on the Haitian Declaration of Independence. And every time I see that, I have tremendous pride in knowing that I descend from those who fought for freedom, fought for their independence. They said liberty or death. And so in my life right now, in this moment, their DNA runs through my blood. So who they were as revolutionaries is still present within me today. And so that is a big part of the work that I do, is shifting the gaze, shifting the way that we see each other, but allowing my own voice and the voice of folks like me to be heard.
And I think that's probably going to be a topic for another time. But it was a really nice image here of something we don't always talk very often, but is that kind of that connection through generations as well, because we talk about the connection that we have between each of us human beings, but sometimes we forget indeed about that connection that comes from other generations, and how do we include them into that diversity and that equity as well. There, I think, is an important.
Well, sometimes those stories come out. Sometimes it's something as simple as maybe looking at our family album, which is part of how I got engaged really through photography and imaging. Is that in the 80s, there was a crisis that was called the Haitian refugee crisis. That's what it was called in the news media. And what the images that I saw of Haiti, it was not it was not congruent to the images in my family album. And so what I was seeing in the media, I was like, but that's my people, that's us, right? And I'm living in the United States, and then this is the image that everyone is showing of IT. And then I'm looking at my family album, and it doesn't coalesce. And so the work that I do is in that. So I founded the Wawa Diaspora Center in 2016 while I was traveling and living in Benin, West Africa. And that was specifically to support the Black diaspora in returning to the continent and being able to reconcile some of the challenges that we have across the waters and misunderstanding each other. I am the director, producer of 3 short films, award-winning projects, one project being the Brooklyn to Benin, a Vodou pilgrimage, specifically looking at Black spiritual traditions and recognizing the space again where it's storytelling that has been told about Black people, about our way of being, is not in alignment with our life, right? So there are many people who are like, voodoo, what? Oh my God, that's horrible, right? But yet, now you have all this new age where everybody's a witch and everybody's a this. And it's like, wow, it's so interesting. Those are the same tenets of Black spiritual tradition, of African traditional religion. But yet, because it has a Black face, it is negative. But when someone else does the same thing, all of a sudden it's fabulous, right? And so there's an equity in that too. There's an equity even in how we're able to worship our gods. How can that be, right? Like, so, and also I have my own podcast if folks are interested in listening, and that's called Voodoo Roots.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Definitely we'll put it in the notes of the episode, as well as the links to all the wonderful work you're doing.
Thank you.
One last question. What's a word of advice or a wisdom you would like to share to close our time together?
A word of advice. I think the biggest thing is that if we recognize that we could shift the world by moving forward with love, right? But moving forward with critical love, which is a term that Dr. Celie Rius, a professor at Columbia University, uses. She talks about critical love, and critical love has a level of accountability to it. So the same way that you and your partner, you can adore each other, you and your wife can adore each other. But there's a place, if you continue not to put your laundry away, there's a place where if you're not upholding your part of paying the bills, of taking care of the children, that there's an issue. Because with that love, it's not always that we can forgive you of the wrongs. No, you have to be accountable to get it right. So if we're able to move forward with this critical understanding of what love is, love that encompasses everyone, that holds everyone within this divine space of acceptance, then I think that we could make that shift.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for being here. The very last question I'm going to ask you is, if people want to continue that conversation, get in touch with you, what's the best way to connect with you?
Sure, you can go to my
We'll put
website.
everything in the notes, but
Yes. So my website is Régine Romain, RegineRomain.com. It's a very French name. My parents decided to give me, out of everybody, my older sister has a German name, my younger sister has a Russian name, but I am Régine Romain. So RegineRomain.com, you can contact me there, and look forward to seeing everybody there.
Brilliant. Well, again, thank you so much for having spent the last hour almost with me. It was a pleasure to have you. And I'm sure we'll find a way to have you back.
Absolutely.
There's so many other topics I think we can cover. But
well, I wish you
so
good
much
luck
again.
with the podcast. Good luck with it. I think it's a great idea. I think it's wonderful to kind of open it up into the space. And and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. We'd love to hear from you. To catch all the latest from us, you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube at As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.